This is a lesson on evolution. I hope you're doing fine out there. What is evolution? That is the question that we've been dealing with as we work through our quarantine at home. You can take some notes, but I don't expect you to write everything down. What is evolution? Well, first, you may have seen that it's the change over time. So you can see this elephant species here probably looked like this a long time ago, and it changed over time. So how do we know that evolution has occurred? That's what this presentation is all about. The evidence for evolution. There's a lot of evidence for the evolution of a species, and the evidence comes from different types of sciences, like paleontology, embryology, anatomy, and we're going to go over all of this in just a moment here. Hang on. So this is just a summary, but you can see here that anatomy would be looking at how bodies are formed. Paleontology would look at fossils, and you might see similarities between animals in their fossils, in how they are built, etc. Here are some more types. You've got biogeography, where species came from, and also artificial selection. We did our own forced evolution as humans and dogs. Dogs started off at wolves, and then we eventually bred them, so we controlled how they mated, and we were able to change the dog over time to look like this cute little puppy here that you see. Fossils. This would be a good definition if you need to copy this definition down by pausing. You can go ahead and pause. Fossils are remains of dead organisms. So you can go ahead and copy that if you wanted. And the question is, how are these fossils formed? Well, you can see there's something called sedimentary rock, and that's kind of what you're looking at here. There's a special kind of rock that can form over time, and when that happens, you can have some bones from the past sort of trapped in this rock for us to find later. The fossil record is something that scientists have made by looking at different layers of rocks, and they can look at a record of how animals have evolved over time. And this next picture will make that clear by looking at what I mean by layers. So here you can see this would be layers in the ground. So we would be, up here, maybe walking our dog. Okay. And then as you dig down into the ground, you would expect that as you got deeper and deeper, you would find fossils that are older. Older fossils are down lower. So by looking at fossils and how they changed from a long time ago and how they were moving on up, so to speak, as more sediment and more sediment. So you would expect there to be more layers later. So maybe in 1 million years from now, our ancestors would be up here and there would be more layers, and maybe you and your dog here would be fossils. Okay. Here's an example of a transitional fossil. That means this fossil could show you how something was transitioning over time. So the Archaeopteryx is kind of like what we saw as being a bridge between dinosaurs from a long time ago and birds from today. Well, we all know what birds from today look like, and we've seen maybe some fossils from dinosaurs from a long time ago. And when this Archaeopteryx came out, or they found it in the sedimentary rock, they were able to look at this and say, oh, parts of this Archaeopteryx look like dinosaurs and parts of them look like birds. So we can say, oh, this must be evidence that there was a change over time. So again, so far, we're looking at the idea that evolution is a change across time. And that's why you made that timeline to see, oh, things can change gradually over time. Like, for example, on Earth, there was nothing. And then over time, so let's say Earth formed here. And then over time, Earth formed sort of like an atmosphere. And that would make sense that after an atmosphere is formed, that's something that you would need to build some oxygen in the atmosphere. And maybe we could say, well, how did the oxygen get there? Maybe plants evolved first. And then once the oxygen was formed, we could start with single-celled organisms and move on to, of course, you guessed it, me and you. Now note that all of the dates, all of the things that happened in our history, like science and the discovery of the Americas, even back to the evolution of humans from their ancestors, all sort of get crammed into this little area next to zero. Because again, all of this stuff takes a long, long, long time to happen. So we've looked at evolution, we looked at a timeline, and then just now we looked at fossils and the fossil record, and how the fossil record shows us that things can change over time, and that fossil record is probably most likely found in sedimentary rock. So that's where we're at so far. As we continue along, we see that there's something called comparative anatomy. Now, what is comparative anatomy? It's actually quite simple. Here you have the general structure for an arm with a hand and fingers. Well, there's something called a homology. And basically, a homology says that structures can be similar. And if you look at some examples here, you can see these very, very different kind of species according to, what we would expect. A human arm, very different from a bat, very different from a bird. But these animals can have homologies with their bones. You see, the previous slide showed us that there is a certain structure in fingers, for example. And if you look at all mammals and you look at their bone structures, you would see that their fingers are all sort of structurally the same. And all of our hands are structurally the same. And our arms. Now, why are they structurally the same? The idea is that since organisms changed over time, we're trying to say here that all mammals, including us, all mammals must have arrived or evolved from a common ancestor, which, was probably a mammal. And what did that mammal look like? Well, who knows? But the mammal, obviously, this ancestor of ours, had fingers, hands, arms, and you cannot say the same thing for a fish or bacteria. You cannot say the same thing for a fly or a flea. These are all things that are very different from us, and we certainly did not evolve from fleas. Now, there's something else that's kind of strange. Vestigial organs. Vestigial organs are basically structures that we have, or that a bird has, or that a reptile has, in our bodies that no longer have a function. So no longer perform the same function as other organisms. Now this is kind of a weird thing, but I am sure you've heard of something called an appendix. What is an appendix for? Why do we have an appendix? Well, you've heard that appendixes, or appendices, I don't know what the plural is, but an appendix has to be removed from some people when it goes bad. So an appendix obviously doesn't have a purpose in our bodies because we can have it be removed and survive just fine, but it must have had a purpose at some point. Otherwise, why is it there? If you think about the wings of a kiwi, it's a bird without wings, but it does have wings. They're hidden. They can't be used. So the question is, why are those wings there? Snake anatomy is such that snakes have bones along their spinal cords that can resemble feet. Little feet or little legs. Well, they don't work anymore, but they're there. They're in there. Whales also have hind limbs and a pelvic bone. Why are they there? The idea is that these organisms must have changed over time, but gradually and slowly, and some things just get left behind. But it's an interesting question. Why is it still there? Why hasn't it just completely disappeared? Well, that's going to have to be the next unit, of course. But just think about this. The fact that we have an appendix. We also have muscles that can help us move our ears. Some of us can use them. What are they for? We have some other things that we have in our bodies that aren't used anymore, but they're still there to sort of imply that we came from some sort of common ancestor. Here's that bone I was talking to you about in whales. Whales have a hind limb? Well, that's just kind of strange, don't you think? What's that hind limb for? Well, it's obviously not used anymore, but it was at some point. And as you can see in the definition here, over millions of years, they became very small and no longer fulfill a function, but they're still there. Now, knowing about this, scientists can look at whale ancestors. They can look at whales. And remember, this is kind of like going back in time. Now, how do we do that? The fossil record, looking at the strata, digging into sedimentary rock, looking through the fossil structure. You see gradual changes over time, and it's unmistakable that these animals are related to each other, and because they changed over time, you can kind of track back and say, hey, look at this. There is some point at which a whale must have roamed on Earth. It has legs. They're hidden in the whale now, but over time, these legs were being hidden, and if you go backwards, you can unhide them, I suppose, if you go backwards in time, and you can see, indeed, that some whale ancestors must have had legs, which means they must have walked on the ground, and that would make sense because whales are mammals. They breathe oxygen, they have lungs, and they use that blowhole on the top of their head. They must have changed over time. And here you have it again. When looking at this very interesting ancestor, this Pakicetus, if you knew about the Pakicetus and you were able to look at its bone structure, you would notice that it has a very strange head. And that head seems to very much resemble a whale, a modern whale, but not anyone else. So how did that happen? We're assuming change across time. Of course, an assumption with data and with evidence. Although, here's the weird part. This is what we would call a partially complete skeleton. And this is a lot of what the fossil record looks like. It's not exactly a clear picture. We have our skull portions, and we have some incomplete fossils. But when we place these fossils together, and we line them up based on what we know in science and based on how these structures should line up and the sizes of these animals, we can say, hey, this Pakicetus was basically as large as a wolf. And its predecessor maybe was the size of a fox. This gradual change, though, can show us how this organism can turn into a whale over millions and millions of years. If we look at another example, a very classic example is horse evolution. Now we can see how the bones can be very similar in a lot of ways, like these legs and their skulls, very similar. However, it is very obvious that the size changed dramatically. It took a long time, but the size went from a small little tiny horse, little horsey, to a big horse. Looking at the fossil record, we can prove that this change was gradual over time. And as you can see here, this change was gradual over time. Now, what's going on here? It looks like this horse ancestor had a need for some sort of toe structure, maybe to climb, something a little bit more useful than what horses have now. But you all know that horses are found nowadays in huge plains. And so if you have this wide open space, you probably don't need those toes. It's probably better if you just have a stump here to run on top of. Another way that we can look at evolution is through DNA. You remember DNA from last semester? By looking at genetics. Now this gets a little less obvious because, genetics are something that you can't see. A stork and a vulture. Man, who would think that a stork and a vulture would be related to each other? Maybe they look the same, but when you start looking at DNA profiles, you can start to see that a stork and a vulture are very closely related to each other. By looking here, you see that they're very close to each other there. But way down here is the flamingo. And I say way down here because I'm starting here. It's obvious to us that through DNA, we can say that a flamingo and a stork have different DNA profiles, must have been from very different time periods, and that even though the flamingo and the stork look similar to us, a stork and a vulture are actually more similar. They're closer relatives than a flamingo to a stork. And that's DNA for you. It's like, tells you a secret story. And this is where we start to find kind of a crazy story. The story of humans versus chimpanzees. Now, I've had students say, I didn't evolve from no chimp. You are correct. You did not evolve from a chimp. However, it is unmistakable that humans and chimpanzees have very similar DNA profiles. Now, you don't have to worry about this hybridization method they're talking about here. They're just trying to explain the process by which you could study DNA. But when you look at this DNA profile here, you can see here when you mix our DNAs, there are a lot of similarities. Now, keep in mind, this cannot be an organism, right? This is not, you can't put a human and a chimpanzee together. It's impossible. One of the things you'll note, of course, when you do put them together is some of the base pairs don't match, obviously, right? So some of the base pairs don't match. So a human-chimpanzee hybrid can never exist. But it's very interesting that we have so many similar base pairs, so many base pairs that actually do sort of look like they match up. And that means that our DNA profiles, because they match up, are very close to each other. So through DNA sequencing, we can look at the genetics of a human and a chimpanzee, and we can say, oh, their DNAs are very closely related, as you can see here. 97.6 similarity. Chimpanzees and humans are very close. Now, look at this guy down here, though. This is a gorilla. Are you related to a gorilla? Do we have a common ancestor associated with a gorilla? And the answer is not really. Gorillas and humans have very few DNA base pairs that match. Our genes are very different, so we assume that whatever we evolved from, it was more similar to a chimpanzee and less similar than a gorilla. So here is a glossary of terms that you could copy down into your notebook, remembering that we have common ancestors. That means that we must have descended from some organism that we have in common with a chimpanzee, or a whale had something in common with another wolf-like looking creature. The fact that DNA can tell us a story. Here's the word evolution, the fact that there can be changes in the allele frequency over time. Now we'll have to describe what that means, what a change in allele frequency is, but evolution is a change over time. Fossils show us bones from the past. Homologous structures show us that structures can look very similar and have the same sort of structure, but have different purposes, like a wing versus a fin. That we can have shared structures by looking at similarities, and we call that a homology. We don't need to worry about that one. The phylogenetic tree that shows how we can be related to common ancestors, and of course fossils, and how fossils can change over time, slowly but surely. Now all of this is, if you may recall, all of this sort of points towards one thing, and that is that animals can change over time, or organisms can change over time. Change over time. And the purpose of this presentation is to show you the evidence that scientists have collected to demonstrate that organisms change over time. And of course, one of the other things we have to keep in mind, if it seems kind of hard to believe that things can change over time, just think about how much time we've had. If you recall from the timeline activity, the age of the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. That's a huge number. Hard to imagine, isn't it? All right. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you got some good notes into your notebook. I'm sorry that you couldn't be with your friends and see my beautiful face during this presentation, but this will just have to do. All right. Hopefully I can see you soon. Take care and have a good evening.